Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. As you can maybe tell, I'm in a new place. We've recently moved to Boston, so the last few months have been very crazy. I'm on the job hunt now here in our new city, and the assumption may be made that this would have been a good time to read something kind of familiar or comforting, but that is not what I've done. This video is about Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh, which is a novel that I think is ultimately optimistic, but certainly an unsettling read. I feel like it's always been like that, like the books don't line up well with what's going on. I feel like I'm always reading like winter books in the summer and summer books in the winter, things like that. So this book was Moshfegh's debut novel, like very much critically acclaimed. She's definitely had some hits since that I am interested in. My Year of Rest and Relaxation is one that I feel like I see all the time in bookstores. That's a book that I feel like makes it to like the staff picks section at the front a lot. And I recently watched this movie, Causeway, on Apple TV that her and her husband wrote the screenplay for, and I really loved that. So this one's been sitting on my shelf for a while, but it just kind of popped into my head that I wanted to read it at this moment. So Eileen is about this pretty miserable young woman living in a small town in New England. And she's kind of a person with no life at all. She has no friends, no experience in the world, no perspective beyond, you know, her very narrow experience of it. And she's spending her life being the caretaker of her alcoholic father after the death of her mother, and also working at a juvenile detention center, which she refers to as a prison for children. And she's this kind of person that's always sort of simmering under the surface. She's very angry and resentful about her life, and she sort of fills up her time imagining leaving, kind of being desperate to leave, but feeling very stuck where she is. And in her kind of isolation and the sort of strange turns of her life, ending up in this caretaker position so young, she's kind of become a bit odd in her own thoughts. Certainly a character who's all set up for something to come into her life and change it. So one thing that's interesting about this novel is the perspective from which it's written. Our narrator is a much older version of Eileen, like 50 years later, looking back on this younger, unformed version of herself at this pivotal moment in her life. So we know from the beginning that Eileen is going to leave, and there is going to be this big material change that's alluded to and that we're building to throughout the novel. Like, we don't know what exactly is going to push her out and make that final decision, but we know we're seeing her last days in this town. And it's an interesting perspective because Eileen herself has changed so completely over the years. And I think maybe because it's Eileen looking at herself, she maybe judges herself even more harshly than a more neutral narrator should when she looks back on her feelings and her thoughts at that time in her life. You know, there's a kind of pain of seeing the way that she once was. And she's also, you know, kind of making fun of herself too. You know, this young Eileen, she's very naive. She hasn't been in the world at all, so she doesn't really understand it. She's very prudish. She's obviously very inexperienced in relationships and very sort of judgmental of other women as a result. And she's like deeply sort of self-hating of her womanhood in general. Like, she's always kind of picking herself apart too, in the way that she picks apart everybody else. She's morbid and really dramatic in a lot of ways, you know, melodramatic all inside of her head in the way that, you know, lots of young people are. And her world is so small, and she lives so much in her own head, and so much of her feelings are unexpressed. She's kind of dead to the outside world in a lot of ways. But the reality is that Eileen can get out. She just can't really see that or believe it, maybe. But she feels very trapped in the role, being sort of the last woman in her father's house. There's this one part in the book where she thinks, "There was nothing I wanted less back then than to be somebody's mother, somebody's wife. Of course, I'd already become just that for my father by the tender age of 24. So she's kind of like allowed herself to fall into this role. And so she goes through the motions of this and kind of does the actions of this, but is very kind of angry and rebellious in her head, and spends a lot of time fantasizing about running away to New York and the day that she's going to leave, even though she's not leaving. And it's this kind of tendency to fantasize and go very far in these things she imagines that leads us to think maybe she might be an unreliable narrator. And also there's definitely some implications that memory, the passage of time 50 years later, the telling and retelling of her life story might have shifted things a bit too. So something else interesting in this novel that seems very much intentional, based on looking at some interviews from the time this came out, is playing with the genre. So this novel kind of touches on the footholds of a thriller. So, you know, the perspective of Eileen looking back, the kind of foreboding sense of something to come. There's sort of a mysterious figure coming to town. There is a bit of a crime element. Though, of course, if you're looking to read kind of a classic thriller like that, I don't think you'll find what you're looking for in Eileen, because we have a main character with no charm, who's often very passive in her story. Her curiosity is kind of all about the wrong things. She's not really seeking to solve the mystery here. And there's no real like plot action until maybe the last 30 pages. So if you're looking for like a thriller in a very sort of straightforward sense, this isn't going to be very satisfying. But the thriller offers sort of an innovative way to have this like character-focused novel to get into Eileen's world. And I think the playing with genre and the kind of like wink of it all about it being kind of a thriller brings a lot of humor into the book. Like very early, there is quite literally a Chekhov's gun, and Moshfegh like really points to it very explicitly in the writing. There's literally a line, "I tell you this simply to put the gun into the scenery." So yeah, I think moments like that are quite funny in this book. And I think there's a lot of humor in Eileen's morbidity also, and the kind of dramatic way she sees her life at this age. I mean, she definitely has a dark humor, and there's a lot of like imagining gruesome things happening to her, I think largely because she's bored. You know, and when we see Eileen like in the juvenile detention center and interacting with her coworkers, I think a lot of her observations are quite cutting and strange, of like the ladies who work in the office with her and this kind of hypocritical, super religious warden. And there's some humor in kind of the contrast between younger Eileen and older Eileen. Like Eileen kind of imagining, confessing how intolerable her life was. But then older Eileen kind of comments, but in fact it was tolerable because she was tolerating it. You know, while the feelings were very painful and confusing when she was young, the older Eileen thinks, I chuckle at it now, but back then I was the bearer of great woes. So Eileen is deeply miserable with her lot in life. So what exactly keeps her from staying there, from not getting up and leaving, or even just leaving a little bit the way that her sister has, who kind of has just gone somewhere else in town? Well, there is this kind of external sense of duty to care for her father, so there's not really anyone left there. And it's a duty not based on him being a good father at all, but really just more about her being the last woman left. And you get the sense that this is really what the town and kind of the they at large think she should be doing. They expect her to fulfill this daughterly duty. They really view her as a caretaker and judge her harshly when she lapses in those responsibilities. And it doesn't really matter that her father is, you know, abusive. It's kind of her duty to be abused by him, which is pretty grim. And Eileen has a lot of anger towards her father, and staying this long, giving up her life, her future, it's almost like this is the way of expressing her anger in an interestingly resentful way, to martyr herself to try to make him feel bad. Like she's sacrificing her whole life to be there, to try to force him to feel guilty about it, to try to get him to sort of express some regret about the way he's treated her. But of course, this kind of like passive-aggressive way of dealing with her father is aimless. Like, he's not capable of giving her that kind of satisfaction anyways. So she's kind of stuck there in a trap of her own design, waiting for something that's never going to come, that her father's never going to give her, and just, you know, being angry at him and imagining him dying or killing him. And it's really that state of waiting for something else to happen that I think really characterizes Eileen. She's not present in her life at all. She's only thinking about the future, her future potential escape from all of this. And I think we see that in the way her and her father live in this home. They live like they are transient, like they're unsettled. You know, there's an interesting detail very early in the first few pages of the book about how neither of them actually sleep in a bed in a room. The father's like in a recliner in the kitchen, and Eileen sleeps on a cot in the attic. And there are beds, there are rooms, but they don't inhabit them. And there's this really great description, it's only on like page 4 of the book, that really hooked me in very quickly, of this house they live in as like an abandoned home. They're still there, but the home is abandoned after the death of Eileen's mother. I don't know, that's such a good picture of this kind of hopeless depression that they've locked themselves in together. And this kind of unchangingness has Eileen waiting for some kind of change, which is either her running away and never looking back, or dying. There's this part, it has some of the early hints of Eileen maybe rewriting the story a little bit. There's a little hint in the language about faltering memory, but she's thinking of this dog they had that passed away, and they couldn't bury it until the ground thawed more in the spring. And she's thinking about burying humans, like before they had equipment to do that in the winter. And she thinks, how did they bury people in the winter in the old days, I wondered. Did they leave the bodies out to freeze until the spring? If they did do that, they must have kept them somewhere safe, in the basement perhaps, to lie in silence in the dark and cold until thaw. And I don't know, that kind of feels like a metaphor for Eileen's life at this point. Like she's just being kept somewhere, waiting to be buried. Again, that's some of her drama coming out, but it's a very sort of movingly lonely kind of passage there. So one thing, when I finished this novel, I went online a little bit, Googled just to see what other people were writing about on the internet. And a lot of people were talking about, Eileen as a character being fascinating in her kind of dislikability and unrelatability. And first off, likability and relatability are not really good metrics by which to judge what you're reading. I think that can be very limiting. And who wants to read only about good people that seem like you? That seems a little boring. But reading this after I finished this novel was all the more concerning for me, because when I was reading this, I found Eileen deeply relatable, disturbingly relatable, because I don't think it's a flattering thing to relate to her. It's looking in a mirror at maybe the worst parts of myself. Eileen's not a child when these events are taking place, but she doesn't really feel like an adult either, because she's so little experienced the world at this point. She feels very unformed and not yet her fulfilled self. And there were aspects of her that felt so familiar from that time in my life, when I was a teenager, maybe the very beginning of my 20s, when I was unformed and angry. Because I don't want to overstate the connection. She's kind of a more extreme version of everything. But it was enough of a connection that I had to take breaks from the book because it was kind of painful to read. And I think it's a phase of being a woman, a girl, that I haven't seen represented very much in literature. In Eileen's words, she is a person who nothing comes easily to. She doesn't feel natural and comfortable in anything, including her own body. I mean, she's overthinking and deeply self-hating. She hides her body. She hates her body. She has a lot of disordered eating, and it's all kind of she's punishing herself all the time and resisting the form that she's in. And she's just deeply uncomfortable with everything about her that makes her an adult woman and therefore a sexual being. I don't know, there's this seething anxiety to her. She just seems so and something that's very interesting about Eileen, and maybe is one of the things that people find, unlikable about her, is that she's so wrapped up in her own issues and her own dissatisfaction and her anger that it's hard for her to see other people, and she's almost incapable of being empathetic at this point. She's around all these boys at this juvenile detention center, and they have had difficult lives to lead them to that point. But she doesn't connect with them in that way. She doesn't feel for them in that way. And I think she's just incapable of it. And it seems the older version of Eileen is much more capable of it. And I definitely could relate to some of those feelings of just feeling like you're poorly made for your environment, that you're very trapped, and just not understanding, maybe because of the inexperienced thing, that it's always your choice what your life is. Eileen has to choose herself to leave and just stop fantasizing about it. I think it's really interesting, you know, I've talked about this in other videos about what a book can mean to you in different parts of your life, different stages when you might revisit it. I had this book on my shelf when I was still in undergrad. I've owned this one and have not read it for a very long time. I remember like starting it and not getting into it and not sticking with it at some point. But I honestly think that was probably for the best, because I feel like all of that would have felt too recent if I had read it then. Like this would have been a very, very unsettling book without, you know, a few more years of perspective behind me. I think maybe that says something about the choice of having this older version of Eileen tell the story, having the perspective being from her, not exactly in it. And I don't know, I think then maybe this is something kind of universal, but the sort of teenage, adolescent, unformed version of yourself, I don't know, for me feels like maybe that was like the worst version of myself, and aspects of my personality that, you know, I had to grow up and maybe overcome a little bit. And I think it can be hard to look back on those years, especially for a character like Eileen, who, you know, delayed her life for reasons that weren't good. I don't know, I just found it interesting that like my experience of reading this was like, oh, this feels too close to home and difficult to read because of that. And then going online and seeing people being like, oh, I don't understand her at all. So, I mean, maybe there's a novel that that person feels deeply connected to that I wouldn't understand at all. But yeah, because of the life she's living, of taking on this sort of settled role before she's even really done anything, she's very isolated and lonely, and in that isolation, she's vulnerable because she just really desperately wants to be seen and have a friend, which maybe means she would accept a friend who's not so great. So she's completely primed for it by every experience of her life, unable to see warning signs because of her lack of experience with other people when Rebecca comes to town. So Rebecca is this educator coming to work at the juvenile detention center. She's very different than anyone Eileen's ever met. She seems kind of idealistic and glamorous, and she looks kind of alive. Like Eileen talks about this like death mask, a lot of these people just kind of plowing through, going through the motions, and Rebecca's not like that. And while Eileen maybe doesn't see it as sort of the younger version of herself, she does seem to recognize as the older version that Rebecca likely kind of understood Eileen right away. You know, Eileen's so internal and maybe thinks that she's hiding those things well, but it might be more obvious to someone with more experience. You know, she's a little more transparent than I would guess she imagines herself to be. And you know, some of the obsessive energy that Eileen has, that fantasizing that she does, when she meets Rebecca, it all gets channeled into Rebecca. You know, she desperately wants her approval, and she wants to sort of like have an intimate relationship, to be special and chosen to be Rebecca's friend. Now, older Eileen, looking back on it, sees Rebecca differently. She kind of sees it all as like, you know, all that glitters is not gold, that there's something kind of fraudulent and cowardly about Rebecca in having these ideals but not really committing to them, and that like underneath kind of this glamour that kind of woos young Eileen, she has kind of a lack of depth. Like, and underneath everything, it's a false glamour, a false morality. It's not authentic. But young Eileen doesn't see that right away. And her fantasies kind of take the turn of Rebecca being her ticket out and them running away together. So I don't know, she has this sense that all this waiting she's been doing, like this is it. Like Rebecca's, you know, the white horse figure here. But of course, Rebecca is not that for Eileen. Eileen has to leave on her own. And the only way to get to that point is to grow, to get a little wiser, to kind of see and understand Rebecca for who she really is. You know, to have real experience living your life in the moment, so you get a little less naive. And on her last night in town, she majorly gets hit with some harsh realities of the real world and real darkness in it. And that's kind of what takes up those last 30 pages of like action, 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 where we're running towards the end being her leaving town. And I won't get into too much detail about that ending because there is kind of a twist moment, so that might feel kind of spoilery. Usually I don't worry about that, like if you've watched 30 minutes about a book. But since this novel is a little different and does have kind of a big reveal, I won't talk about that. But you know, there's this gulf in the whole book between this younger version of Eileen and this older version, and they're so different. And it's really in those last pages of the book, our very last moments, that we see how this girl is going to become this woman that's been telling us this story. And a big part of that is letting this younger version of herself, letting all this stuff that she's been holding on to as her role in life, letting all of that die. And it seems like the only way for Eileen to become this person is to leave and never look back. And it's kind of like independent of the circumstances of what happens at the end of the novel and any crimes that may have happened. She would have had to leave like that anyways. And there's this echo at the end that I really liked. Early in the book, we see Eileen kind of picturing in her head what it would be like if an icicle fell off the porch and just like impaled her and her life ended there. She has this kind of passive suicidal ideation. It's like this just sort of grim humor moment from her. But when she's leaving her father's home for the last time, an icicle does fall, but it doesn't kill her, it just cuts her face and leaves a scar. I don't know, that's just like this symbolic death of her old life, this symbolic death of this angry, unsatisfied, unwilling to live version of Eileen. And she is kind of reborn in that moment to this new version of her life. And you know, she's not a perfect person and her life doesn't seem to be a smooth path after that. She's certainly morally very gray. But we end on a note that after that she lives a full life, and a life that's lived in the moment, and she learns how to enjoy her life as it's happening. You know, she's outside of her head, and those kinds of insecurities and that self-hatred has gone away because she's looking out more. It's really a beautiful note. And I think, you know, despite kind of the challenge of reading about a character like this, I do think it is hopeful and optimistic in the end. Yeah, I thought this novel was remarkably good. It had me very hooked. I read it back to back with my husband, who was also totally hooked in it. Yeah, I kind of can't believe this has just been like sitting on my shelf for so long, but I'm very interested in reading more from Moshfegh. Okay, that is all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.